Welcome everyone to Community Wealth and the Coming Recession. You're probably watching this after a week of volatility with markets, with Bitcoin, with NFTs. We have yet to see if this is just a quick blip on the radar before perhaps some better trends kick in, but there are major institutions that have for some time now been projecting a downturn of the global economy over the coming years. And so that has many people feeling apathetic, feeling helpless, feeling hopeless in the face of bigger factors and unsure how they can carve out better economic paths for themselves and their communities. What we're going to try and do is help provide a community wealth lens that may serve as a little bit of an antidote to apathy. And we have a wonderful guest today, the political economist Vijai Kumar, who's going to help us break down some of the issues today and perhaps some of the solutions as well, so that people can maybe leave this feeling more empowered as to what they can do as individuals, as community activists, as city councillors, as people who are engaged in the political and economic process. And I'm first going to have a little conversation with Vijay, and then we're going to get to some questions that have been submitted by citizens, activists, and city councillors from across Canada. Before we delve in and bring in our guest, I'm going to present a community wealth lens for people who are unfamiliar. The term community wealth building began with a group called the Democracy Collaborative in the United States, which architected the Cleveland model of community wealth, which was first used to start pulling people out of poverty in a very poor neighborhood of Cleveland, Ohio, where the median income was $18,500. The community wealth model that they instituted about 14 years ago has since nearly quintupled in size. So it has not just had success, it's had rapidly expanding success. A larger version of that model was then taken to the city of Preston in England, across the pond. It went on to be named the most improved city in the United Kingdom. Since then, community wealth initiatives have been popping up around the world. The city of Chicago just announced a $15 million community wealth building pilot project. Our work as a volunteer organization focused on local democratic economics around worker cooperatives, community land trusts, and the progressive use of anchor institutions is to bring this kind of activism and this kind of political economy to communities across Canada. The premise is very simple. First, we look at the different ways in which members of a community can hold wealth in common. A community of workers holding ownership of the company that they work for, having access to the company's profits, the best version of which is a worker cooperative because it's also democratically controlled by the workers. That's a great example of community wealth. A community land trust. We talk about the housing crisis in Canada a little superficially right now. It's not just that the cost of physical structures have been going up, but the land values underneath those physical structures have been going up. That's why the same house in one community can cost much more than a house of the same size and caliber in a different community. And that's a part of why people are holding on to empty housing units as speculative commodities, even as people are desperate for affordable housing. In a community land trust, a plot of land is taken off the market on a permanent basis and put under the control of a local nonprofit organization, usually on a 99-year lease, primarily to provide permanent intergenerational affordable housing, but it can be used to provide affordable access to any kind of development that community might be needing. So it's a very versatile form of community wealth. And then anchor institutions, we often don't realize how much progressive investment is potentially at our fingertips. But in all of our communities, we have nonprofits, public, quasi-public enterprises, that have to purchase goods and services from outside organizations. And they cannot just get up and leave our communities. We're talking about religious institutions, performing arts centers. We're talking about libraries, hospitals, universities, and colleges. Collectively, they have to purchase many billions of dollars of goods and services from outside organizations. And they all have mandates to organize on a nonprofit basis. So they can choose to purchase locally, to invest in good jobs in the local community rather than multinational corporations that are going to put the profits in offshore tax havens, and sometimes the wealth completely disappears from the community altogether. The step that the Democracy Collaborative took in the United States that was a simple stroke of genius was to look at how those different elements of community wealth can inform each other and build off each other, so that you can have democratic cooperative banks, credit unions in your community, seed grants from municipal funding, public banks if you've got them, to help start worker cooperatives in your community. You can have your anchor institutions purchasing goods and services from those worker cooperatives, anchoring those good democratic jobs in the community and the profits going into the hands of many different local worker owners who are going to spend that money locally. It's going to keep doing good things in the community. And then as the prosperity grows and the land values go up, you've got your community land trust there to capture a portion of them, keep people from being pushed out through gentrification, keep those land values going back into the community. Potentially what we could have are democratic jobs, good investment, affordable housing in perpetuity. That's the basic framework that we are looking at to help look at alternatives to the current way of doing things and addressing some of the problems that people are facing as we address the likelihood of a major economic downturn in the coming years. I'm going to introduce our guest now, and I'm just going to bring up his bio. It's quite a rap sheet. Vijai Kumar is a public policy enthusiast with a range of research experience at multiple governing levels. He has held research positions at the Indigenomics Institute, the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, better known as the OECD. He has also worked as the policy manager for the Bay Area Climate Change Council. Vijay holds a Master in Global Affairs from the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, as well as a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Waterloo. A proponent of community wealth building, Vijay volunteers to address the crisis of homelessness in the Greater Toronto Area. He is a proponent of community land trusts and missing middle infrastructure, providing research support to community groups and nonprofits around affordable housing solutions. He also enjoys demystifying economic policy for non-economic audiences through his writing. Having a musical background, Vijay is an advocate for the arts and is currently sitting as an advisor to the Arts, Culture, and Creative Industry Development Agency in his hometown of Brampton. He also occasionally freelances for music and culture publications like Exclaim magazine. Vijay, thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Thank you, Colin. I appreciate that. Thanks for inviting me to talk with you. I just want to say, just right off the bat, that I don't want to feign expertise here. I think economics, political economy is something that should be understood from a multitude of disciplines, and and I learned about community wealth at the beginning of the pandemic. So there's a lot to learn, and I just hope that I can learn from you, and we can all learn together as a community.
Absolutely. I think that one of the things that people are trying to do right now is bring their decentralized knowledges to the table. What do we know about history, about community, about economics, about politics, and how can we maybe bring some of these things together? And so some of the questions that I'm going to have for you today, Vijay, are going to pertain specifically to community wealth, but we're also going to look at some of the economic trends that are confusing for people right now. So let's begin by just looking at some of the issues that are threatening the economy as it's sometimes sort of dehumanized as. What are some of the things that we are facing right now? And do you think it's reasonable for people to be concerned about the direction that the economy is moving right now? Should we expect turbulence, basically?
I think so. I think people are justifiably concerned. I am. I think the main issues that we've been seeing are related to the structures as they're set up, right? I think the main concern that people should be worried about is politicians talking about wages as if it's just another input, Right. And you have to look at the economy as buckets, right? The a government deficit is essentially a private sector surplus. So if you're not raising taxes and you're not increasing fiscal monetary policy in some sense, expansionary fiscal policy or monetary policy, let's say, essentially what you're doing is you're creating unemployment and you're attacking wages. And I think that's ultimately what people should be worried about. I'm worried about the sort of conventional responses to fighting inflation through increasing the interest rate and trying to rein in fiscal policy and all of these things. I think it will create immiseration, and it's a path to austerity. I think people are justifiably concerned.
That's a really good point. There's a lot of anxiety about a looming recession, but we are coming through a huge economic recession in some respects. It's just been such a strange one because it has had this cover of COVID over it. We've kind of had in some ways I won't say a break from austerity, because I don't think that's been the experience of ordinary working people. But there has been, in some ways, a suspension of a dedication to austerity economics for a period through this recession. Yes. And what we are seeing is, as we face perhaps a more standard economic recession without all of those extras loaded on top of it, a return to diehard austerity economics. And there's going to be a major push for that. Would you say that I'm accurately describing what you're talking about there?
I would say so. I think that's correct. I think in some ways as well, to add on to that, we're sort of paving our own path to a conventional recession in some ways, right? I think it was the chairman of the Federal Reserve, who brought up the threat of a stagflation, 70s style stagflation, right? Which in some sense is, in very simple terms, cost push inflation, right? Supply related inflation, the cost of goods becoming more expensive, right? Or inputs becoming expensive. And the policy response being contractionary monetary policy, essentially increasing the interest rate. So what you do is you increase the interest rate, which de facto increases cost of living. A lot of people have mortgages and credit cards and a line of credit. And then you have this supply side cost push inflation, which is wholly indifferent to, you know, the investment decisions of, you know, domestic investors, let's say. And you just have you know, an increasing inflationary environment. Things are getting more expensive, and eventually, we're not seeing it yet, but eventually you have slowing economic growth and more unemployment. And that is a result of monetary policy, right? Increasing the interest rate. We're not there yet, but in some ways we're paving the path to a conventional recession by using conventional sort of austerity economics.
I think it's here important to remember one of the standard lines about inflation that really kicked in after the stagflation of the 1970s. It became bigger after the stagflation of the 1970s. And it's important here, we are going to talk a little bit about employee ownership in a moment, but employee ownership is usually not considered part of the conversation. We are usually talking about the standard model of a complete division of workers and owners. And like you say, workers' wages are just kind of another input that gets kind of in an inhuman way categorized in there, thrown in there. And so the normal story that we really heard in the 1970s was that if workers have too much power, they will drive up their wages, and then the separate owners will increase the prices on everything because they have to create their usual profit margins after they've paid the workers. And so the solution to this, and this is not a left-wing interpretation, this is coming straight from the horse's mouth, as it were, is that the solution has to be that you have a group of people who are unemployed, and they will be desperate. And then you will have the rest of the workforce eager to not be the desperate unemployed. And that will drag down the wages for the workers, and that will be the cure for inflation. It is a kind of with friends like these who needs enemies sort of statement. And again, this is not a left-wing interpretation. When Alan Greenspan said that the American economy would be in real trouble if unemployment went under 4%, he wasn't criticized for saying that. He was criticized for saying that they could go as low as 4%. Others were saying
conventional economic wisdom. Exactly. It's the NIRU, the non-accelerating rate of inflation, or unemployment rather. This is the Phillips curve. It's Pierre Polyev, Polyevonomics or whatever it's called. That's exactly right. Yeah.
And he is also a right to work legislation guy.
Yeah, anti-union guy.
We kind of talk about austerity just through the lens of government spending, but it's not just about government spending. It's also about, as you say, unemployment and driving down workers' wages, which you could describe, and I believe you have described before, as another form of inflation. It isn't actually getting rid of inflation. Right. I'm not putting words in your mouth here?
No, that's exactly right. I mean, for better or for worse, the economy is financialized. Canadians especially rely on debt to service a lot of their lives, and increases to the interest rate effectively increase cost of living, especially in a regressive way, especially for individuals who are lower middle class. You know, they a few $100 means a lot every month, right?
Right. Yeah. I think that this gets into, and I want to address that in a moment. We're going to talk about how we might, instead of looking at driving down workers' wages, look at driving down the cost of living, and how perhaps that's a different kind of approach, which of course will lead us to community land trusts, which I know is something that you're particularly passionate about. But this element of household debt that you have brought up, household debt in 1980 was, I believe, 66 cents for every dollar of disposable income that the average citizen had. Now, right now, I believe it is, the last time I checked, which was a couple of days ago, $1.84 of household debt for every dollar of disposable income that the average citizen had. Now, we are here talking about credit cards, student loans, car loans, mortgages. After 2008, when it was household debt and private debt that crashed the global economy, it still is not talked about as the threat from mainstream politicians in particular and economists. Government debt, government debt, government debt makes the headlines. But it's poor people who first off feel that in their day-to-day lives, and also it's poor people who often have to default.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think, as you said, I mean, I don't want to repeat it, but I think so often the analogy of governments being like households and having to manage their finances like households is so pernicious and dangerous. And we see organizations like in the US, the Heritage Foundation; in Canada, our equivalent is the Fraser Institute. They are so good at weaponizing that language and creating this perspective that governments need to balance budgets in order to be fiscally responsible and to achieve growth in some meaningful sense. And what that does is it creates an impression in someone's mind. It creates a beautiful framing, but as we've talked about, as you said, it kind of travels in. It kind of invites the unemployment and the idea of cutting wages and all of that as a way to fulfill the goals of shareholder primacy, the idea of creating value for owners and boosting. We saw throughout the pandemic a lot of layoffs resulted in inflated stock prices and things like that.
That's a really good point. I want to start moving towards some of the things that we might look to reverse some of the problematic trends that we have right now. So first off, I wanted to bring up something that has already been mentioned, but employee ownership. Now, we are living in a world in which we are experiencing a lot of supply chain shocks that are from a complicated internationalized economy. We are also seeing offshore tax havens now storing many, many trillions of dollars of wealth that working class people have worked very hard to produce and are now completely outside of their communities. And this is making our economies at every level, the municipal, the provincial, the federal, much more fragile and much more turbulent. What do you think of employee ownership as a way of potentially addressing some of these issues of perhaps making our economies not just more fair, but also more resilient, which is kind of the key word right now?
I love the idea of ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans, and I would love to see the explosion of ESOPs in Canada. I think Bill Young and Social Capital Partners are doing great work on that front, and I was happy to see. I believe it was the 2021 federal budget. There was mention of employee ownership.
Yes, creating trusts, making it possible for workers to form trusts around employee ownership. Yeah.
That's exactly it. Yes. I mean, the economic benefits are quite clear. It helps with employee retention. It creates this, again, we talked about shareholder primacy, which very simply is just this I guess, this divorce between ownership and the interests of owners and the interests of labor, right, of employees. It kind of merges those worlds, and I think that kind of solves a lot of. I think it creates it's more welfare maximizing. But I also beyond the economic benefits, I see social benefit. I see the idea of feeling this sense of ownership at work and having some decision-making power, which in some sense, talking about the atomization problem in our society, a lot of people feel very alienated with their work and very disconnected from the end product. And I think ESOPs kind of create this environment where employees are in some sense part of a community, and I think that's missing in our social landscape.
I think that's a really important point that you bring up. And I wanted to throw something else in the mix, which is that right now we have this cascade of retiring baby boomer entrepreneurs. It's sometimes called the silver tsunami. A lot of these companies do not have succession plans. And employee ownership is a potential route to use this as a stabilizing effect. Rather than firing workers, closing down companies, we could be passing them down. The way that you've just put that, I had been thinking about that primarily in economic terms, but of course, a lot of these businesses are cultural hubs in their communities. So
exactly.
Yeah, we are talking also about retaining cultural heritage, about retaining the gathering places that mean a lot to communities, as well as just talking about improving jobs.
Absolutely, and I mean that also is kind of part and parcel, and comes with, in some sense, worker reform and workplace reform. I'm a believer in work. I'm not anti-work. I think there's a lot of important work to be done. At the same time, I think this trend that accompanies globalization, which is consumer value, I think, and that's another beautiful framing thing that neoliberals have taken over. It's this idea that we're providing consumer value by outsourcing work to jurisdictions where we don't have to pay workers anything, and they create products, and they're cheaper for you to buy. Like, that's inherently a good thing. I don't mind paying a premium to invest in my community, to invest in this idea of social mobility and this connectedness with each other, which also comes with a to borrow job guarantee terminology, socially viable wages, or living wages, whatever you want to call it. And yes, I think when it comes to secession plans, that's part and parcel of the problem, right? That we're so disconnected from work that there's no allegiance anymore. And again, I get that workplaces need to earn that, but we need to create the environment so that we feel that connection to work.
Right. I think that we can now look also where community land trusts perhaps come into this. When we look at, you mentioned job retention, keeping those skills in the community, keeping those skills in the enterprise, there is greater job security that comes with employee-owned companies. They're associated with higher wages very consistently.
Yes.
So that's looking on the increase side of things. Community land trusts also feed into the other side of things, which is that we've got these skyrocketing land values, and they're really increasingly under the control of private speculators. And private speculators, if there is a recession, will probably be looking to clean house on that recession. So can you speak a little bit to why you are so interested in community land trusts, and why you think other people should be paying attention to community land trusts? And if you think that this is a particularly important moment as we look at both the skyrocketing costs of living, but also being able to keep some control of our properties to ourselves in this age of predatory speculators.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer in community land trusts. I think the problem of housing and house prices, it's a complicated problem, and it's a bit of a, what do they call it? A bit of a, it requires a multifaceted solution, right? It is true that we need land use reform, right? It would be great if the province can commit to rezoning the entire province, so that we ban single zoning for single family homes alone. We need more multi-residential homes. We need secondary dwellings. We need missing middle infrastructure, all of that. And but on top of that as well, you have the demand side solutions, which involve restrictions on home equity line of credits and using them for down payments on homes, right? There's a bit of scapegoating where we blame foreign buyers for the rampant speculation, but that represents maybe 3 to 5% of the market. It's mostly domestic investors, and investors buying a property, using the equity from that property to buy one more, and buying another, and so on and so forth. So we need to rein that in a little bit. But where I see community land trusts as being very, very interesting is that it essentially declares that housing is or I should say being housed is a community asset. It's important for non-market reasons, right? Non-wealth related reasons, or individual wealth related reasons, right? It's about creating intergenerational wealth. It's about the dignity to be able to live in your own place that you've invested in, and you can take that equity to sort of move on with your life, and creating that, keeping that wealth within a certain boundary within a community. And so community land trust essentially, when we're talking about housing, it takes property out of the market and essentially socializes the ownership of that property among members of a community. And it's inherently democratic, right? There are many different ways to set up a community land trust, and you get to decide how that that asset is used, right? It doesn't even have to be a home. It could be a community garden. It could be anything that's sort of
Right.
important to your community. And I think why that's important to the solution in this whole complex Gordian knot of a problem is because it fundamentally changes our relationship to the concept of housing and the concept of things that should be community assets, right? And that is missing from the conversation. Housing is seen like NFTs. It's this store of value, and that's so perverse to me.
Right. That's a terrific answer. Thank you so much for that. One of the things that you're doing really well here is I'm giving you kind of hard, pure economic questions, and you're putting this in a holistic lens, that it isn't just about people doing better at their job. It's about the community that they're in, the autonomy, the connection that they have. It's about remembering that the economic actors are human beings and that they are socially connected to their surroundings and to the people that they are working with and living around. I want to bring in something that we've had some questions about. And I often talk about how when we use anchor institutions to purchase locally, when we purchase from worker-owned companies whose workers are going to get access to the profits, the money keeps doing good things in the community. And this brings in a concept called velocity of money that is a kind of technical concept that a lot of people are unfamiliar with. And so I was wondering if you could perhaps break down that term velocity of money so that we have that at our disposal a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. I mean, my exposure to that term velocity of money has been through a conventional economics education, and that has been sort of, for the most part, owned by the monetarists. So velocity of money is very simply is essentially measuring the circulation of money in an economy. So the frequency with which a unit of currency is exchanging hands in an economy, right? And conventional economic wisdom is that the higher the velocity of money, i.e. the higher frequency with which a dollar is being used in an economy, exchanging hands, the healthier the economy, the more economic activity is happening in the economy. And it leads to resilience because, it's not like it's being used once and then going into a bank account and just staying there, or just, it's not that it's not productive, it's productive, right? When in the community wealth context, I've noticed a lot of people using the term velocity of money as keeping things local, right? Using local procurement strategies, local hiring strategies, ensuring that if you have a dollar, you're not going, across the ocean to source your materials, right? You're actually giving that dollar to a local business, buying their materials, and that local business can now use that dollar to now buy something else. And it keeps the demand and the supply within a certain boundary, and that creates a healthier, more vibrant economy. And so I think something like the Cleveland model, for example, or let's keep it more general, the idea of anchor institutions, right? Being very strategic in the sense that if you hire locally and if you procure locally, right, you're engendering economic activity within a community, right? You could look at it from a hub and spoke industrial district model. You can look at it from a Marshallian perspective, which is a bunch of little firms that create economic activity. I did my undergrad at the University of Waterloo. I've seen firsthand the benefits that the University of Waterloo had on the surrounding city, right? There are a bunch of cultural amenities that wouldn't have been there without the university. There are a bunch of startups, and even Google and BlackBerry, all of these companies, innovative companies, wouldn't have been in Waterloo had it not been for the university. So there's this there are knock-on effects with things like anchor institutions that increase the velocity of money and keep money and therefore economic activity within a certain boundary.
What you're talking about is how a dollar in a community invested a particular way is going to be a dollar that many people use and that does good things for many different people in that community, as opposed to a dollar in an offshore tax haven. And I think a lot of people are using an economic model that is treating the dollar in the offshore tax haven the same as the dollar that's being reused in the community.
That's exactly it. If I could plug a book, The Value of Everything by Mariana Mazzucato, I can't even begin to enumerate the nuggets of wisdom in that book. But one thing that sticks out to me is the idea that in the calculation of GDP, first of all, the calculation, the arithmetic that goes into GDP is highly ideological, right? Like the idea that education, for example, will always be expressed, public education, I should say, will always be expressed as a cost, because it costs a lot to educate children and pay teachers and all of that. And there's no profit, there's no direct profit mechanism with education, with public education. Whereas, you know, something like finance, the industry generally, right, can reinterpret moving money from one area to another as adding value for some reason, because it creates, you know, there's this profit there that you know, individuals can exploit, and that, you know, positively affects GDP.
So educators are not productive and the financial sector is. Gotcha.
Exactly. But like it is profound and unfathomable, the investments we make when we invest in education, right?
Yeah, that's very, very well put. And I have many other questions along this line that I would love to ask you, but I think they pertain to a lot of the ones that have been submitted. So I'm going to bring up some of the questions that have been submitted and throw them your way. Sure. First, I have a question, Trent from Nanaimo, British Columbia, who actually sent in a couple of questions for us. Is community wealth building compatible with those who are using a donut economics model? And there was another question that was similar to this one, Laura from London, Ontario. Can it speak to the climate crisis? So this is a fantastic question. For those who do not know the donut economics model, this is Kate Raworth. She's talking about how we have to be, on the one hand, producing enough to create human thriving. And on the other hand, we have to be sticking within our planetary boundaries as climate change becomes this growing concern. So my answer is community wealth work is kind of the practical application of the donut economics parameters in many ways. And she actually does talk about things like worker cooperatives in that book. But without me delving into it further, I'll turn the mic over to you, Vijay. What do you make of that?
Well, I was just going to say I would love to hear your thoughts, but I think that's a really interesting connection, because when I think of community wealth, I think that the dominant sort of neoclassical, neoliberal paradigm has been looking at wealth or value creation as divorced from real resources. So the idea that we have balance sheet constraints, but in reality, we have real resource constraints, right? Right. That's sort of the insight that modern monetary theory kind of gives us as well. And so when we think about community wealth, I think of it as a movement from viewing assets from a balance sheet perspective and instead viewing it from a real resource perspective. And community wealth allows you essentially to incorporate what the market would view as externalities. It wouldn't naturally price in, you know, pollution, climate change, all this stuff, because it's sort of exogenous to the market mechanism, right? Whereas community wealth allows you to have conversations about real resources, about things that are important to you and your community and your culture and your identity and whatnot. I mean, again, like these are sort of non-economic issues, but that's sort of the problem, is that the market abstracts these concepts to numeric values, and sometimes we have to think beyond that.
Yeah, you know, I think of how many mainstream Hollywood films there are about lawyers who have to take on corporations that have pumped toxic waste into the water and have, you know, destroyed their communities. Yeah. And there is no question of, you know, the workers would not choose to pollute their own communities in the same way. Just on the most basic level, they would not pollute their communities that way. But it's not their call. It's somebody else with an abstract balance sheet, right? Yeah,
and it's usually you know, individuals and corporations that have no ties to a community. It's inherently extractive, right?
Yeah, I live in St. Catharines, which is what Gar Alperovitz might call a throwaway city. He's one of the founders of the Democracy Collaborative, in that we had a major employer, General Motors. And basically the city's economy was built around General Motors. And it made a lot of money for workers for a number of years. And then General Motors left, and we have the wreckage of that General Motors factory near our downtown that has not been able to be cleaned up for about a decade. And a huge portion of that factory has actually been part of the work that General Motors, you know, maybe not specifically that factory, but the general activity that is moving to Mexico and other places where they can get a cheaper deal, and is being rebuilt there. So we have enormous ecological waste. We have this huge devastated part of the community, the human waste that is involved with that. Yeah. And this is not what community wealth is about. It's not going to throw its own community away. And it's not going to participate in the ecological waste that is there. And then the things that it is doing, community wealth is allowing people to use their resources in concerted ways. You know, in the last Canadian federal election, climate change came up. It was astonishing. It came up as the #1 concern that voters were listing above all other concerns. That blew my mind. In the middle of deep economic turmoil with the housing crisis where it was, in the middle of a pandemic, climate came in as the #1 concern. But a lot of people right now do not have structures that are allowing them to act on their instincts and act on their community connections as well. And so community wealth building is a way of also giving people the autonomy to do things that are not just about the bottom line of some investors from outside of the community.
Yeah, it's beautifully said. I love everything you said. I earlier in our conversation, I compared anchor institutions to a hub and spoke manufacturing or industrial district, and that was, you've explained why that is not a perfect comparison, because the GM in St. Catharines would be considered a hub and spoke model, right? But an anchor institution typically is a nonprofit organization, a university or a hospital or something like that. What's a hospital going to do? Are they going to just move to Mexico? Like, no, they're not, right? There's inherent ties to a community, right? You have to service people from that community. And
right.
I think that's well said. Yeah.
Thank you, Trent, and thank you, Laura. This is from Brad Clark, who is a city councillor in Hamilton. I do have a concern that many residents have maxed out credit cards and lines of credit on their home equity. Banks were encouraging it when the interest rates were low. However, with rising interest rates, I expect an increase in mortgage defaults, which could bring housing values crashing down. That's I think, a fair concern. Vijay, did you want to comment on that a little bit?
There's so much there. I mean, to address this person's question, will it result in house prices crashing down? I don't really think so, because I mean, the interest rate increase alone might result in short-term selling off, right? All these people who wanted to flip houses, they're selling homes, and that's sort of depressing house prices a little bit. But it's returning to what, November 2020 levels? Like the real problem is high net worth individuals, real estate investment trusts, REITs, institutional investors, all of these individuals who have assets, who can leverage equity to buy more homes, put down payments on future homes. The insufficient housing that we're building, that's the problem. That's what's leading to this speculative drive in our economy.
That also pertains to another question that we have here, because you just brought up a term. And that question is, what is the difference between a community land trust and, I think REITs is the acronym that you use?
REITs, yeah, REIT. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, they're profoundly different. A REIT is essentially a company that owns profit-earning property. There's a profit incentive there. There's a market mechanism at play. Community land trusts are completely different. It's taking the asset out of the market. It's socializing ownership. It's essentially the nonprofit version of a REIT that socializes ownership.
So it's kind of so the first one is kind of like mega landlord.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we've seen an increase in REITs recently in Toronto in the GTA, and it's a problem because REITs aren't concerned with interest rate increases, right?
So I would break that down as simply as possible, and I think this all pertains back to what Councillor Clark is talking about there. And as we look at maybe breaking this kind of spiral that he's so concerned with, we should be putting community land trusts over REITs. That's
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. We need to proliferate the community land trust model. We need, these REITs to say, we can't buy anything in Toronto or in Ontario or Canada because all these community land trusts are propping up and they're socializing ownership. So, yeah.
The next question that I have here, and this is from Trent again: can community wealth work be undertaken by activists who are not in public office? Fantastic question, Trent. If we were to look at all the different forms of community wealth work that are being done across Canada and the United States right now, actually most of it is being done outside of public office.
Yeah.
Community land trusts are community nonprofits. They are often facilitated by people who are in government. For instance, underused government lands are sometimes gifted to community land trusts. Yeah. We also see governments that offer subsidies to help community land trusts purchase properties. But the community land trust organizations themselves are usually outside of government jurisdiction. And then anchor institutions are often organized, certainly the work that the Democracy Collaborative has been doing, which was the first one to really bring together a big circle of anchor institutions. It was a nonprofit think and do tank that was going out there and organizing basically people who want to be good actors in their community and have a continuous role in that community, and starting to get them to commit to purchasing locally for community benefit. So it is really useful to have people in government doing community wealth work, but it is equally important to have people outside of government doing that, and then to build partnerships between the two that bridge those gaps. That's my answer to it, but I'll turn it over to Vijay.
Honestly, that's a great answer. I think there's a massive role for people outside of elected office to get the ball rolling with respect to community wealth. That being said, what I will say is I think it makes it a lot easier if elected officials were being spoken to in sort of maybe a lobbying fashion, I don't know, and educated in a sense. And you know, there are things that they can do to make it easier for the activists and the advocates to do their work. For example, land use reform, making it easy for you know, multi-residential building to be put up in a community that can be socially owned, you know, via community land trust, for example. And, you know, maybe providing some funding, discretionary funding in municipal budgets, let's say, for the incubation of a community land trust, or, you know, initial seed funding for the first purchase of a community asset. I don't know, but there's definitely mechanisms that government can utilize, but the work is going to be mainly driven by people outside of politics.
Great question. Thank you, Trent. Here we go at the very end here, and this is from someone who wanted to remain anonymous. They just wanted the question asked. But this one is about political polarization. And they were asking about how community wealth can maybe be used to address issues with political polarization. And I think this actually also pertains to another question that Trent asked about people who are working in an intersectional through an intersectional lens versus those who are working through purely an economic lens. And so I'm going to kind of maybe tie those two questions together. They're very good questions. What I'm going to say is that I think first off that community wealth work is in some ways, it's in no way right wing, but it is in some ways, you could say conservative, in that it is about local decision making. It is about people being rewarded for initiative in their community, for labor that they do through employee-owned companies, getting fully compensated for their labor. It's about people being in charge of their own lives. And so there are elements of this which are in the best sense of the word conservative, conserving good jobs, creating sustainable practices in the community, being able to hand potentially something that's kind of been taken off the charts recently, but we might even begin to imagine handing a higher standard of living down to the next generation. And of course, Vijay, as you've discussed earlier, but having more environmentally sustainable practices. In that sense, it is more conservative. And I think that allows us to speak across some of the traditional party lines. And then another thing that it is doing is diversifying ownership of capital and ownership of land. And one of the things that we see when we look at the cooperative movement, the worker cooperative movement, the community land trust movement, is they're far more diverse than the leadership that we see in, say, Fortune 500 corporations, the starting points from which all the other forms of wealth build. That's actually being diversified. And so it also speaks to, I think, a pretty dynamic vision of what a just economy is moving forward. So I'm going to throw that out there, but Vijay, would you like to comment on that question?
I think that I love the comment about community wealth being this sort of the temperamentally conservative position. I can't really, I don't understand why there's been this flip where communities and families all of a sudden became a progressive thing, and now conservatives are all about liberalization and atomization, and it's strange. But really, if we think about even in the American context, this like Tocqueville, democracy in America, small towns, and local decision making in communities. Like that's a very conservative idea, from in an American context. And yeah, I mean, we're talking about conservation of the environment, conserving, good jobs, for example. I think this Fordist model was for a long time seen as sort of this conservative position. So yeah, I think that's brilliant. And I will say, in terms of polarization, I think the best antidote to polarization is talking to your neighbors and creating linkages and a sense of empathy for one another, and having local democracy is another great way to foster civic connection, civic engagement. And I think this not to sound curmudgeon-y, but social media has created this exacerbated the atomization problem, and I think we need to get back into real politics and real democracy. In the sense, when I say real democracy, I mean not to say social media isn't real democracy. I mean real life, physical space democracy, where we're in a community center and we're voting on things and we're talking about things, and we're disagreeing and we're agreeing and we're crying and we're hugging and we're laughing. Like that's part of the antidote to polarization. So.
One of the things that has come through this conversation that you brought out so well, Vijay, is that we, at any rate, just being focused on the right priorities, we should be looking at the way that economics is interrelational, the way that it is about the strength of our communities, our social relationships, our sense of purpose and meaning in our communities. And that if we are facing the possibility of an economic downturn right now, if we are facing problems with the cost of living being extremely high already and people being precarious because of that, and we start looking to things that are going to reduce the cost of living, like community land trusts. We start looking at things that are going to improve wages, like employee ownership. We start looking at things that are going to give communities more autonomy, like anchor institutions taking a concerted role. We might not just be finding ways of being more resilient economically and better off economically, but we're also talking about ways of being better socially, as communities, as people with relationships to those around us. And we might be able to actually focus on building a quality of life. Yeah. So Vijay, I want to really thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate this. It's been a very enlightening conversation.
Thanks, Colin, for having me. I love jamming with you and discussing these ideas, and it's great to be able to explore something that's hopeful and that kind of provides optimism, especially at a time where things are so uncertain. We started this conversation with the first question was, should people be concerned and worried? And I said, yes, absolutely. But by the end of this conversation, I mean, I think we have the tools to make a better society and electorate, a more informed citizenry, and we just have to operationalize it.
Wonderful. Yes. Thank you so much, Vijay, and thank you everyone for tuning in.